Welcome to the Bullvine Podcast. Today we're trying something new. Instead of our regular hosts, Douglas and Bella, we're featuring an experimental episode. We're excited to showcase this new approach and would love your feedback.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Bullvine. Today we're diving deep into a feed ingredient that could be a real game changer. I'm talking about boosting your milk check profitability by as much as 15%.
Wow, 15%, that's significant.
Yeah, and it's all thanks to a feed you might not expect, whole cottonseed, or WCS as you'll hear us call it.
No, I bet some of you are thinking, hold on, isn't cottonseed risky? You know, you've heard things, maybe some rumors.
Right. There are those concerns about Gossipol, plus the whole hassle of storing and handling it. Like, is it really worth it?
It's definitely been a topic of conversation, that's for sure.
Exactly. But that's why we're doing this deep dive here on the Bullvine to cut through all that chatter and get to the hard facts.
We want to look at the science, the real-world results, and see if WCS can truly live up to the hype.
Especially now in 2025, with milk prices hovering around that $18 per hundredweight mark, every penny counts.
You've got to be sharp with your financials, and that means looking at all your options, even those you might have dismissed before.
So we're going to find out if whole cottonseed could be your secret weapon, especially for boosting those all-important milk components like fat.
For this deep dive, we've got some fresh research hot off the press from the Journal of Dairy Science, and we'll be looking closely at a 2025 trial from the University of Minnesota.
We're going to break it all down, the costs, the benefits, the practical steps. By the end of this, you'll know if WCS is right for your operation.
Sounds good to me. Let's get into it.
Okay, so first things first. Here at the Bullvine, we've been seeing a lot of buzz about what some are calling a whole cottonseed renaissance. Why is WCS suddenly getting so much attention now in 2025?
Well, like we said, milk prices aren't exactly soaring, right? Margins are thin, and that's putting pressure on every single input on the farm.
Producers are really scrutinizing their feed costs, trying to optimize wherever they can.
Exactly, and they're starting to rethink ingredients that maybe weren't on their radar before.
Kind of like, hey, let's take another look at this WCS thing. Maybe it's not so bad after all.
Right, and this is where that 2025 University of Minnesota trial comes in. It provided some really solid evidence that not only is WCS safe at a 15% inclusion rate, which, let's be honest, was a big concern for a lot of folks.
Yeah, the Gossipol thing had everyone spooked.
But this trial went further. They actually showed that WCS has the potential to significantly boost profitability, like real numbers, not just speculation.
Speaking of real numbers, we've got a great example featured on the Bullvine, the story of Schlitzer Dairy in Wisconsin. They made a simple switch, swapped out 5 pounds of soybean meal for WCS and their cow's diet.
And what happened? Their milk fat jumped up by 0.3 percentage points.
Which doesn't sound like much, but for an 800 cow herd, that translated to an extra $1,200 in revenue per day.
Every single day. Talk about impact. So yeah, WCS has real potential.
But you've been careful to say it's not a magic bullet, more like a precision tool. What do you mean by that?
I mean, you can't just throw WCS into the mix and expect miracles. You need to be strategic about it.
It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. You have to understand how it sits into your overall feeding program.
And how it impacts your milk components, particularly fat. That's crucial.
So let's talk about that focus on milk components, especially fat. Why is it so crucial right now? We touched on the economics, but there's more to it, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. With the rise of value-based pricing systems, the components in your milk, they're like gold.
It's not just about the quantity of milk anymore, but the quality.
Exactly. And milk fat is often the most valuable component. If you can increase your fat content, you can significantly increase your pay price.
So any feed ingredient that can reliably and cost-effectively boost milk fat is a huge advantage.
And that's where WCS shines.
So what's the secret? What does WCS have that makes it so good at boosting milk fat?
It's all about its unique nutritional profile. First off, it's got around 21% fiber.
Which is good, right? Fiber is important for rumen health.
Yes, but it's not just any fiber. It's what's called effective fiber, which means it keeps the rumen working properly without making the cow feel too full.
So they can eat more and produce more milk. Got it.
Then there's the fat content, about 17%. And this fat is released slowly in the rumen, which is key.
Why is that so important?
Well, when fat is released too quickly, it can go through a process called biohydrogenation in the rumen, which can actually lower milk fat.
So it's counterproductive.
Exactly. But with WCS, that slow release minimizes that risk. It's like a time-release energy source for the cow.
Interesting. And to top it off, WCS also provides a decent amount of protein, around 24%.
Which means it can be a real cost saver compared to other protein sources like soybean meal.
Okay, so we've talked about the why. Now let's get to the how much. The 2025 University of Minnesota trial had some really interesting data comparing a 15% WCS diet to a control diet using cottonseed hulls and soybean meal. What do they find?
Well, let's start with milk fat yield. The cows on the WCS diet averaged 12,210 grams of milk fat per day.
Compared to the control group at 1,100 grams per day.
That's a 10% increase in fat yield. Pretty impressive.
But what about the cost? I mean, WCS isn't free.
Right. The feed cost per ton for the WCS diet was a bit higher, $315 compared to $298 for the control diet.
So on the surface, it seems as the WCS diet is more expensive.
But here's the catch. When you look at the income over feed cost, the WCS group came out ahead at $6.42 per cow per day.
Versus $5.88 for the control group. That's a difference of 54 cents per cow per day.
Which might not sound like much, but think about it. For a 500 cow herd, that's an extra $98,000 per year.
$98,000. That's a new piece of equipment right there.
Or maybe you can hire that extra hand you've been needing.
It all goes back to what Dr. Linda McMullen, as quoted in the Bovine article, was saying about focusing on components.
Smart operators, she called them. They're not just chasing milk volume, they're looking at the value of each component.
And they're managing their feeding to optimize those components because that's where the real profit lies.
And WCS is a powerful tool to achieve that.
Okay, so for our listeners here on the Bovine, how can they apply this to their own farms? How can they take advantage of this WCS potential?
Well, if your co-op or processor offers a premium for higher milk fat, WCS is a no-brainer.
It's a direct path to increasing your milk check.
You're basically getting paid more for something WCS helps your cows produce more of.
But what about farms in areas with flat milk pricing where components don't really affect the pay price? Is WCS still a good option?
Even then, there's a hidden value in WCS, and that's feed efficiency. When you feed WCS, you're likely to see an improvement in your feed conversion ratio.
Meaning you're getting more milk solids for every unit of feed you use.
Exactly. So even if you're not directly paid for the extra fat, you're still saving money by using less feed overall.
Less waste, better resource allocation, it all adds up.
But there's an important caveat here. Our Bovine article mentions this. Some processors actually have penalties for too much milk fat.
Really? That doesn't seem very fair.
It's all about their processing capabilities and their specific market demands.
So it's crucial to check your processor contracts carefully before making any major changes to your feeding program.
Don't assume anything. Get it in writing.
All right, now let's talk about the elephant in the room, the practical side of things. WCS has a bit of a reputation for being difficult to manage on the farm.
True, it can be prone to heating, especially in warm, humid climates.
But our Bovine article highlights some great solutions, like what 10 Harm Soul Farms in Indiana is doing.
They're using repurposed grain bins with aeration systems, just like they do for high moisture corn.
Clever. They just run fans for 30 minutes twice a day, and it keeps the WCS cool and prevents spoilage.
It shows that you can adapt existing infrastructure with a little creative thinking.
So what other storage best practices are out there?
Well, for larger operations, commodity sheds with walking floors and dump trucks can really streamline the handling process.
Makes sense. What about in those humid regions where heating is more of a problem?
Coated or pelleted WCS can be a good option in those situations. They're less susceptible to mold growth.
And then there's the technology side of things. We're seeing more and more farms using automated moisture sensors in their silos.
Those sensors provide constant monitoring, so you can catch any heating or moisture issues early on.
Technology to the rescue. But storage is only half the battle, right? There's also the challenge of mixing WCS properly in a TMR. It's notorious for causing sorting issues.
Yeah, because of its shape and density, cows can easily pick out the tastier bits and leave the WCS behind.
Which defeats the whole purpose of feeding it in the first place.
So what can you do? Well, one trick is to pre-mix the WCS with something like ground corn before adding it to the TMR.
That helps distribute it more evenly, so it's harder for the cows to sort it out.
If you're using a vertical mixer, the best approach is to add the WCS last and keep the mixing time short, like 3 to 5 minutes max.
Overmixing can actually make sorting worse. Interesting.
There's also some promising research into using liquids like molasses or whey permeate in the TMR.
They act as a kind of glue, sticking the WCS to the other particles. Now it's time to address the big fear, Gossypol. For years, this has been the major concern with feeding cottonseed.
But the good news is, the 2025 University of Minnesota trial put those fears to rest.
They carefully monitored the cow's blood for Gossipol and found that the WCS group averaged 4.2 micromoles per liter.
Well, the control group had 1.1. Now, the toxic threshold for Gossipol in dairy cows is around 25 micromoles per liter.
So even with 15% WCS in their diet, these cows were nowhere near that danger zone.
In fact, the Bovine article mentions that a cow would need to eat about 35% WCS daily to even approach those toxic levels.
So at the recommended 15% inclusion rate, the risk is minimal.
The research is clear on that.
So where did this whole Gossipol scare come from?
Well, it's a bit of a historical hangover. A lot of the earlier research focused on cottonseed meal, not whole cottonseed.
And those are two very different products.
When you make cottonseed meal, you extract the oil, which concentrates the Gossipol.
But in whole cottonseed, that oil is still there, and it's released slowly, which actually helps limit Gossipol absorption.
Plus, new cotton varieties have been bred to have lower Gossipol levels and smaller seeds.
So the Gossipol risk is even lower now than it used to be.
It's a case of science catching up and dispelling some outdated fears.
This is why it's so important to stay up to date on the latest research.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of learning from others, the Bovine article highlighted some interesting global perspectives on WCS use.
Yeah, it turns out dairies in other parts of the world have been successfully using WCS for years.
Like in Israel, for example, where some top dairies include as much as 18% WCS in their rations year-round.
18%? That's a lot. How do they manage the storage?
Their dry climate definitely helps. But they also have a clever trick. They pair WCS with rumen-protected lysine.
And that helps them consistently hit that sweet spot of around 4.1% milk fat.
It's all about finding those nutritional synergies.
What about other countries? Any more inspiration from abroad?
Brazil is another good example. They use pelletized WCS, which makes it easier to handle, especially in their humid climate.
And they're including up to 20% in their rations.
Meanwhile, in Australia, where 15% inclusion is common, they're big on using technology.
They've got those automated moisture sensors all over their storage facilities
to ensure top-notch WCS quality.
So what can U.S. dairy farmers learn from all this global experimentation?
Well, first, climate matters. You need to adapt your storage solutions to your specific conditions.
Like using pelleted WCS in humid areas?
Second, think about nutritional pairings. Can you combine WCS with other ingredients to maximize its benefit?
Like the Israelis do with rumen-protected lysine.
And finally, don't be afraid to embrace technology.
Those moisture sensors can be a real game changer for storage management.
So there's a lot we can learn from our international counterparts.
Now let's talk about the environmental impact. Our Bovine article debunks the myth that WCS significantly reduces methane emissions.
Yeah, the 2025 trial didn't find any significant reduction in methane from feeding WCS.
So if that's your main goal, WCS might not be the solution.
But that doesn't mean it's bad for the environment.
It can still have indirect benefits through improved efficiency.
Like using less feed to produce the same amount of milk.
And sourcing WCS locally can reduce transportation emissions.
Plus, better storage means less spoilage and waste.
So it's not a direct methane solution, but it can still contribute to a more sustainable dairy operation.
All right, so let's say a listener is convinced they want to try WCS. What are the practical steps they should take?
Our Bovine article lays out a great 90-day roadmap.
A step-by-step guide to get you started.
The first couple of weeks are all about preparation.
Establishing your baseline milk components, sourcing your WCS, making sure your storage is ready.
Aim for WCS with around 16% fat and 21% protein.
And get your storage set up. Whether it's a commodity shed or those repurposed grain bins, make sure it's good to go.
Then comes the introduction phase, weeks 3 and 4.
Start slow, just a 5% inclusion rate to begin with.
Watch their intake, make sure they're adjusting well.
And do weekly milk tests. You need to track those components from the get-go.
Then in weeks 5 through 8, you gradually ramp it up.
Increase to 10%, maybe tweak some other ration components, and keep doing those milk tests every week.
Finally, weeks 9 through 12, it's full implementation time.
Push to that 15% if everything looks good. Pay close attention to your mixing to prevent sorting. And now's the time to really analyze your numbers. Is the WCS paying off?
And what about beyond those first 90 days?
It's all about ongoing monitoring and analysis. Fine-tune your storage and handling, and don't be afraid to share your results with other producers.
The dairy community thrives on shared knowledge.
Exactly. We're all in this together.
Okay, so bottom line, is WCS the next big thing for dairy profits?
Based on what we've seen, I'd say it has serious potential, but there are 3 key things you need to get right.
storage, component tracking, and being open to learning from others.
If you nail those three, WCS could be a real game changer for your bottom line.
But there's some important warnings too, right? Those critical considerations.
Absolutely. First, double check your processor's policies on milk fat. You don't want any surprises there.
And while the research is promising, it's generally recommended to avoid high levels of WCS for breeding bulls.
Just to be on the safe side.
And finally, remember that feeding WCS to high-producing dairy cows is very different from grazing beef cattle on cotton residue. Different animals, different needs.
So for anyone who's still on the fence, what's the next step?
Well, the Bovine article has a great suggestion. Run a small trial on your own farm.
Take 50 cows, implement a WCS feeding program, and see what happens.
Track their milk components weekly, crunch the numbers, and let the results speak for themselves.
In today's tight market, sometimes you have to think outside the box.
And WCS might just be that unconventional solution you've been looking for.
So just to recap, what are the key takeaways from today's deep dive?
Well, first off, WCS can boost your profits. The research shows a clear increase in income over feed cost and a significant bump in milk fat yield.
The Gossipol fears are largely unfounded at that 15% inclusion rate.
And there's a lot we can learn from global dairy farms that are already successfully using WCS.
The key is to implement it strategically, using a phased approach and monitoring those milk components closely.
And of course, always double-check those processor policies on milk fat.
So to sum it all up, whole cottonseed at that 15% inclusion rate has real potential to transform your dairy's financial performance.
It can replace those traditional feeds, streamline your storage and mixing, and minimize those Gossipol risks.
By learning from global best practices and implementing WCS carefully, you can turn those thin margins into sustainable profits.
It's all about looking for innovative solutions, even in unexpected places.
And that's what we're all about here at the Bovine.
If you want to learn more about WCS and connect with other producers who are using it, head over to the Bovine website, www.thebovine.com.
You'll find the full article there, packed with even more details and insights.
And be sure to share your own experiences and questions about alternative feed strategies.
We love hearing from our listeners and learning from each other.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, keep those milk checks flowing.
Thanks for tuning in to this special episode of the Bovine Podcast. Today, we explored how whole cottonseed could be your dairy operation's secret weapon for boosting milk fat yield and profitability. From its nutritional benefits to practical implementation tips, we hope this deep dive gave you actionable insights to consider for your herd. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's experimental format. Did you enjoy the change, or do you miss Douglas and Bella? Your feedback helps us shape future episodes and keep delivering content that matters to you. Until next time, keep innovating, stay profitable, and remember, every feed decision is an opportunity to grow. This is the Bovine Podcast, signing off.